today, which will be discussing fiscal anchors and whether they are the right solution for debt sustainability in South Africa. We're joined this afternoon, myself, I'll be chairing the session. I'm Joan Stott, and I'm a senior program officer at the Institute for Economic Justice. I work on climate finance and resource mobilization. For our presentations, we have two other panelists from the IEJ, Zimbale and Mncube, who works on tax and South African advocacy, budget advocacy, and Liso Mdutyana, who works on international financial institutions. We then also have Mr. Michael Sachs joining us from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at WITS, and Krige Siebrits from the University of Stellenbosch, where he is a senior lecturer. Okay, so for all of you who have joined, we did send out a concept note, just a bit of background. The National Treasury, along with its medium-term budget policy statement in 2024, announced that it would be releasing a document around fiscal anchors for debt sustainability following this year's budget. The IEJ did publish a discussion document, which is available on our website. And we thought that ahead of the national budget, which will be tabled in Parliament on the 19th of February, we should just have this kind of roundtable discussion on, whether it is kind of the right approach for debt sustainability, given all the socioeconomic challenges that South Africa faces. So now I will hand over to Zimbale and Mncube, who himself and Liso will take us through some of the IEJ's research on this issue.
Thank you for getting us underway, Jones. I'll try and share my screen, and I hope everyone can hear me and also see my screen. You'll just let me know once the presentation is up. Okay, cool. So our presentation, as Joan mentioned, is taken from our discussion paper, and we are going to present our findings as well as why we think a new fiscal rule is not the answer to addressing SA's debt concerns. I'm just trying to click next. It's not moving. Okay, cool. So our key argument is as follows. I'm just going to go over it and then we will get into the details. We believe that the National Treasury has misdiagnosed the current challenges with debt in South Africa, and that the proposal for a fiscal rule will not sufficiently address them. And from our discussion paper, we highlighted several experiences as well as international trends, which show that fiscal rules and their experience is complicated by a number of political and economic risks, and these have an impact on their effectiveness as well as compliance generally. We also show that South Africa's own experience with the expenditure ceiling highlights some of these very serious risks that should be taken into account. And therefore, we draw some lessons, which Lisa will share later on, a few key lessons that needs to be taken into account as the National Treasury considers a new fiscal rule in South Africa. Ultimately, we conclude that rather than a fiscal rule, South Africa needs a paradigm shift where we have new targets such as unemployment and job creation, and where fiscal policy is seen as a tool to drive inclusive growth and structural transformation. And these are some just contextual and definitional issues which I won't go deep into, but it's useful to remind people what these rules are. So a fiscal rule is a long-lasting constraint on fiscal policy through numerical limits on budgetary aggregates. So targets things such as the government deficit, the levels of borrowing, or debt levels as measures through the debt to GDP ratio. So we've seen over a number of years, fiscal rules have grown in their use, with different countries adopting them to manage and respond to different crises, but to also counter the tendency of government to run budget deficits. And there are also different categories within these rules. There are those that primarily aim at restricting budget deficits and debt. There are those that are aimed at stabilizing broader macroeconomic fluctuations. And these are the sort of different types of rules. Like I mentioned earlier, some of them will target debt. Some of them would look at the budget balance. And so that is the gap between the government spending and revenue. Some of them will look at the extent of government spending itself, that is expenditure rules, as well as revenue rules that set ceilings or floors on the tax to GDP ratio. I think for our purpose, we've not seen the detailed proposal from the National Treasury, but we believe that it's likely going to be a combination of the debt rules and the expenditure ceiling. So those who support fiscal rules claim that they can act as a device that limits government's use of discretion, and they can also serve as a signaling device in that they highlight the government's plans and priorities. And this can, of course, lead to more foreign direct investment and stable macroeconomic conditions. They also claim that they serve as a political function and that they help to manage uh, and stabilize coalitions, given that there are clear numerical targets that the government pursues as opposed to priorities that are set by different political formations of the day. So here's how we believe that the national sees the current challenges we face. We believe that they've approached the challenge to say that government spending and borrowing has contributed to wider budget deficit, and this has led to an unsustainable increase in the levels of the debt to GDP ratio, as well as the borrowing cost. And as a result, it has led to crowding out of private investment and contributed to poor levels of economic growth. And hence, we find that the solution that is proposed is a combination of debt management strategies, including budget cuts, which we have seen since 2012, as well as a restraint on the primary fiscal balance as set out in the medium-term expenditure framework. And then more recently, we've seen that they argue that a new binding fiscal rule is needed to target the debt objective and complement the existing expenditure ceiling, and that this will lead to a reduction of debt and stabilize our unsustainable sort of borrowing costs. We believe that this is a misdiagnosis of the current challenge we face, given that South Africa's debt to GDP ratio is on par with emerging market economies at about 75%, whereas middle-income countries are at an average of 73%. There's also no clarity as to, which level at which level does the government think that the debt to GDP level is sustainable or has negative economic consequences for the cost of debt? And then believe that there are a number of internal as well as external factors that are contributing to an increase in our interest payments. And these are not limited, but they also include our poor levels of growth. They also include our, ailing state-owned entities. We've also had challenges with particularly ESCOM, which has had unstable history with supplying power more recently, as well as the role of the South African Reserve Bank in hiking interest rates. So we believe that a combination of these factors has contributed to the increase in our borrowing costs, which we believe are the key challenge that we need to address, because we see that South Africa is paying much higher in terms of its interest payment at 5% compared to middle 5% of the GDP compared to middle income countries at about 3%, right? So here's what we think from our paper. We've picked up that having mapped out why this is a challenge, why we believe, there is a mixed diagnosis of the current challenge, we get into the actual rules themselves. So what has been the experiences with the rules? And I'll get into some of the critiques that we see in the existing literature, and I'll hand over to Liso to speak about the international experience and what lessons can we take from that. So we found that fiscal rules tended to constrain fiscal policy in terms of responding to external shocks where government is required to intervene. So because fiscal rules are so rigid and impose certain strict measures on government cannot respond. And I think an example that we've seen recently was the COVID-19 pandemic, where a few countries had to either bypass their rules or change their laws in order to respond and support COVID-19 recovery. We find that fiscal rules lead to non-transparent behavior, whereby government use very opaque accounting practices to bypass the rules. And this is more likely in environment where there's large deficits and debt sustainability concerns, such as in South Africa. We find that over time, fiscal rules may also reduce the quality of fiscal policy, given that they are not necessarily prescriptive on the composition of fiscal adjustments that is required, and that this results in important social priorities cut, as well as capital spending. In our context, we've already seen how through austerity, there's been several cuts extended to healthcare, education, and other social priorities. And this is something that the government committed to in the MTBPS, and we'll see, I think, more of as we go into the budget. There's also, we've also found that there are actually mixed results in terms of the impact of fiscal rules on fiscal performances, and that this depends on some contextual factors, as well as issues such as design and the types of institutional framework that is put to support these rules, as well as the broader economy of the day. Lastly, there is, and I'm hoping that maybe our guests will expand on this, but there is lack of clear evidence pointing to the causal relationship between fiscal rules and fiscal outcomes. We find that some fiscal outcomes depend, like I said, on a number of issues, including the contextual factors of that particular country, as well as other government interventions that are taken. I'll hand over to Liso, who will quickly get us on with the international experience, what we find from that, as well as what lessons can we take for South Africa.
Thanks, Zimbale. I'm hoping everyone can hear me well. I'm still trying to turn on my camera.
Yeah, I can hear you.
That's good. That's good. So despite there being kind of a lack of a clear causal relationship between fiscal rules and fiscal outcomes, we find that globally fiscal rules are becoming more common. In fact, the period of the most rapid uptake of these fiscal rules was kind of between the late 1990s to the early 2010s. We saw a lot of countries, developing countries, developed countries, adopt fiscal rules, especially in response to economic crisis. We know during this period where the Asian and the Russian financial crisis were the global financial crisis. So it really has emerged as one of the key tools that countries have used to try and reinvigorate their economies and to try and enhance, the credibility of fiscal policy. Even still, the compliance with these fiscal rules has kind of been mixed. We see that all over the world, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, it is often the case that countries break these fiscal rules. And as Zimbale just said, this is often in response to economic downturns, in general. So the compliance is quite mixed. So about half the time countries do comply, but the other half there is not much compliance with either of those rules, regardless of whether they are kind of binding or not on the executive. I think we can move on to the next slide. So this is just an illustration of how prevalent the fiscal rules have become, especially in more recent times. Thanks, Zimbale. So what we kind of wanted to have a look at in the discussion paper is to see how they have fared in specific political economies, because I think we can miss the proper details if we simply do an analysis of which countries adopted and which countries complied. So we tried to have a more in-depth look at the cases of Brazil and Indonesia. We chose them obviously because they are comparable countries to South Africa in terms of their dependence on natural resources. They are comparable to South Africa in terms of income level, in the same income groups as these countries. And we thought they are particularly useful because they have had relatively long histories with fiscal rules. It's not a recent phenomenon with them, unlike other countries. They have had an extensive history such that we can study the changes through different, government administrations. And we found that in both instances, if fiscal rules, they emerge as a crisis management tool. So both countries were really affected by the Asian and Russian financial crisis in the late 90s. And as part of the response package, they took on finance from the IMF, and there was a real push for these countries to have a more kind of stringent fiscus. And then fiscal rules were really imagined there to solidify this commitment to fiscal consolidation as part of the program. And where these countries did abide by the fiscal rules, what we generally see is that they were aided by things such as the privatizations of state-owned entities, because in both countries, one of the primary sources of discretionary government spending, so government spending maybe beyond what has been budgeted, was bailouts to state-owned enterprises, was the recapitalizations of state-owned banks. So once these governments made the decision that these might be privatized, it kind of allowed, it kind of reduced the pressure on the fiscus to spend on things that, you know, may come up or may not come up. And especially it's interesting with the case of Brazil, because one of the primary sources of discretionary spending there was the fact that subnational governments, so state governments and local governments, they had been defaulting on their loans. And one of the ways in which the national government was then able to stabilize the situation was to reduce the borrowing powers of those subnational governments. But in general, we found that even with the institution of these fiscal rules, the primary objective, which was to reduce the debt service costs, was not immediately realized. In fact, it took up till the commodities boom, the global commodities boom, which was in the mid-2000s. It took up until then for government finances to recover to the point where they are able to actually adhere to these fiscal rules. Yeah, thanks, Zimbale. And we see then that once growth started to stagnate globally as a result of the global financial crisis, compliance with these fiscal rules became extremely difficult and led to a great deal of conflict between forces in society over the fiscus. Should we spend on this? Is this really something the government should be looking at? And then we see that this is the general trend across countries, not just the two that we went in depth with. It generally depends on the balance of forces, what the outcomes would be. So, for example, in Indonesia, you know, the pressure to adhere to these fiscal rules led the government to decrease its subsidy on energy. And we know energy had underpinned much of Indonesia's long-term growth. And one way in which they were trying to compensate for this, because this energy subsidy was highly beneficial for poor households, is to then do a cash transfer to poor households. In the case of Brazil, the non-compliance with these targets led to more stringent fiscal rules in 2016 and 2023. But as of recently, we see that Lula's government has kind of relaxed its stance on fiscal rules, even though they are still there as part of the public finance management framework. And so the lessons we think that could be taken from for South Africa from the case of Brazil and Indonesia, as well as generally other countries, is that economic growth appears to be the major explanatory variable for changes in fiscal aggregates. And it is really difficult to disentangle the contribution of fiscal rules. Now, this may also be due to the methodology we adopted in undertaking these studies. We think our findings are quite preliminary. We think it would be it would even be more useful to do something that is has more quantitative rigor in order to try and disentangle, you know, the size and then, you know, the direction of fiscal rules. And it is the kind of work we will look forward to doing But in general, we found that fiscal rules may be ill-suited to a world of growing external shocks because, as we said, it kind of restricts the ability of a government to respond to shocks. And perhaps it might point to the fact that in designing a fiscal rule, if really you are to have it, then there must be a lot of escape mechanisms so that in times of crisis, we are able to abandon the fiscal rule and are not unfairly tied to it. And we see, of course, that there is nothing about the fiscal rules that should necessarily lead to developmental outcomes. We said typically the outcomes, the fiscal outcomes depend on the balance of forces in society, who has more pull on what choices the executive makes, those kinds of factors. And again, as we've seen, the implementation of fiscal rules does not necessarily lead to compliance. There has to be a lot of political buy-in within the executive, within society, for these kinds of rules to really be complied with. And then we think fiscal rules may also distort spending in unhelpful ways. And we'll touch on this, I think, in the next slides. And then fiscal rules are also not a substitute for budgeting based on negotiation and consensus building with stakeholders. So this goes back to what we have just said. Political buy-in matters a lot for whether a fiscal rule will actually be abided by. So you need to budget in such a way that you are able to negotiate perhaps deals over a long term to make, let's say, for example, the public sector wage bill more predictable over the upcoming years. There is trust between labor and government so that they know, okay, this year, this is the increase I will get, and we'll certainly get it. We have negotiated and there's a level of trust, and the other year we'll get it. That's how we kind of get a buy-in for these fiscal targets. And then lastly, we think a monetary policy has quite a significant impact on borrowing costs that is not acknowledged in the degree that we think it should be by National Treasury. Thanks, Zimbale. I think we can move on to the next page. And then just to close off, fiscal rules may encourage the use of opaque accounting techniques to comply with numerical limits. We saw this especially in the case of Brazil, that, the bureaucrats in the administration, when achieving the fiscal rule kind of becomes an end in itself, it kind of incentivizes them to adopt creative accounting. So essentially fraud, lying about expenditures that have been undertaken, or not putting them on the books or putting them elsewhere, disguising them as something else. So that is kind of the incentive sometimes when this fiscal rule becomes an end in itself. And we think also, given South Africa's legal framework when it comes to who has the final decision on spending, which is ultimately Parliament. Parliament passes the appropriation bill. Parliament passes the fiscal framework. Parliament passes the division of revenue bill. It is unclear whether a fiscal rule will in fact place a binding limit on the expenditure. So any undertaking of a fiscal rule that is legally binding will kind of have to be evaluated in this light. What does it mean for the powers that the Parliament has? Does it not infringe upon those powers? Or does the Parliament not untie itself in a way that is, not useful? And just the last point on the lessons for South Africa, we think the push for binding fiscal rule kind of underscores the influence that the IMF has on South Africa's policy making. We have seen that it has primarily been the IMF which has pushed the issue of rules-based policy making, basically, and in particular fiscal rules across the world. And we have also seen it in South Africa with the recommendations they have made, whether that be in the finance South Africa has taken, or that has been, in the reviews that they do annually of the country. And our conclusion then is that if the National Treasury really wants to achieve a more sustainable fiscal path, it needs to build a political convergence behind such. So that doesn't mean if fiscal rule is out of the way. It means in order for even a fiscal rule to be something that is considered, there needs to be political convergence behind that. So this requires mechanisms through which spending and revenue raising represents the outcome of collectively agreed prioritization rather than centrally imposed fiscal restraint, which we believe a binding fiscal rule would be. And we believe that a fiscal policy should, instead of just having the objective of stabilizing the level of debt, should also look to maximizing economic growth, reducing unemployment, expand the supply capacity in the country, ameliorate against destitution and hardship through things such as social grants, social assistance, and provide for comprehensive social and care services while supporting the social wage. I think we have one more slide, Zimbale, or are we done?
Yes, we are.
We might be done. Okay, so that's basically our conclusion with regards to a fiscal rule. We don't think there is overwhelming evidence worldwide to support the fact that it can significantly enhance the credibility of fiscal policy. And we think that there are other variables that are much more important than putting in place a fiscal rule for fiscal policy to be more credible. I think we'll hand over to Joan to take us through the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Liso. Thank you very much for, and Zimbale, thank you very much for that input. I think it's already, at least in my mind, started, some questions have started evolving. But to continue the presentations, let's move on to Michael.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I think this is an important discussion, and I haven't prepared slides. I'm just going to make a couple of points in response to the paper and the presentation. Really, yeah, I hope it's just 2 points, but as we are wont to do in universities, those 2 points might evolve into a bigger animal. But the first point, the first question, I suppose, or issue is fiscal sustainability a problem that we should be concerned about in general, in abstract, and also in the concrete conditions that South Africa faces today? And if I read the paper, I think the conclusion one reaches is that it is not a problem that South Africa should be concerned about. And so this is my first kind of point, right? And so I should say before proceeding that I agree with many of the conclusions of the paper, probably almost all of them. But I want to take the discussion forward. I think some of the arguments I don't necessarily agree that are put forward in the paper. So let me say that. Of course, what is fiscal sustainability? Fiscal sustainability is always rooted in more fundamental factors than fiscal policy. It is always dependent on political, social, and economic sustainability. So if we reach a conclusion that fiscal policy is not sustainable, that, it's this thing of debt sustainability analysis and the graph and what's the projection of debt for the next 10 years. We can do all of that, but it always rests on a value judgment, essentially, or some form of judgment about future development trajectories that we expect to take place, right? But, the first thing is that we must understand that, and that is very true, But it is also the case that for the state, for policymakers in the state, the problem of fiscal sustainability is objectively a pressing problem. It's not an ideological problem. If it is an ideological problem, it's because that ideology is so powerful that it's manifested as concrete reality that we face as a small open economy with a third-tier currency. Right? That's what we are. And in that situation, in my view, you know, this isn't you have to manage it. And in particular, if you have an agenda of progressive change in a society. In other words, if you are if you regard yourself as some kind of left government, and I don't want to go into whether our government is that, but I'm saying if our program is transformative and progressive, then, and if the constituency we represent is not capital or bankers, but a popular constituency, then this question of fiscal sustainability is even more important, because, you know, capital doesn't seem to be too concerned that Trump is running an unsustainable fiscal policy. Everybody agrees he is, but it doesn't seem to be a problem for him. But it is a problem for Lula. And that's why Lula administrations have been very serious about addressing the question of fiscal sustainability. So this problem faces, if you are in government, in the National Treasury or in the presidency or wherever you are in government, this problem of fiscal sustainability is a real problem facing you. And you have to then ask the question, and you have to look at it and say, is South Africa's fiscal position sustainable, right? In its own right, whatever we might think of long-term political, social, and economic developments. And I would say, my view, my judgment is that it is not. It is not sustainable. In the simple sense that we cannot continue along this trajectory forever. It will, you can't keep. There's some change in trajectory that must take place, right? Because pressures are building up in the system, and debt service cost is one of those pressures. And in a real so you can look at it like the MMT folks do, as this is all just made up. But actually, there are institutions in society that, for instance, collect tax, and then that tax is used by government to finance spending. And as debt service costs rise, more of that tax is now allocated to the debt service costs. This is not a problem that you can just say, well, don't worry about it. Just focus on other stuff and that one will go away. It doesn't seem to be going away. It's a pressing problem. So, and if you look at our, just at the fact that the interest rate we pay on government debt is higher than the rate of nominal GDP growth, that we are one of the few countries in the world that is in that position on a permanent basis, right? There is no other country, even countries that have much higher debt burdens than us, don't have that position. So it's not about our debt level is 70% or 73% or 75%. And I think it's almost a contradiction in the argument, because you're kind of saying the rule is not making sense. And I agree, because exactly this debt level target for me doesn't make a lot of sense, for reasons that I won't go into now. Yeah, anyway, so I think we are in an unsustainable situation, which means that fiscal policy has to change in some way, right? So that's the first question. And so the other people might disagree with me that fiscal sustainability is a problem, but I'm saying that's my judgment, and I think that's the judgment of most people. And in any case, that's the judgment of the people we're borrowing the money from, which is why part of the reason why the interest rate is above. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So so Neil is saying that you don't see anything that so I'm responding to the idea. So let me pose it as a question. Are you saying fiscal sustainability is not a problem? Because it sounds like when you're saying National Treasury has misdiagnosed the problem, that's kind of how the argument sounded to me, that you're kind of saying the problem, it's like other people will say, it's not a debt problem, it's a growth problem. It's kind of saying the same thing, that this problem of debt and fiscal sustainability, you're focusing on the wrong issue. It's not really the issue we should focus. So many people argue that, let me say, and many people on the left, even if IEJ is not arguing that. And so that's the first issue I want to put on the table, is that do we in this discussion regard fiscal sustainability as a problem? And I'm saying I do, right? So then that leads me to my second point, or the second question, which is the question I think we should all be asking ourselves, including National Treasury, which is, if fiscal sustainability is a problem, what is the political basis of fiscal sustainability? Because the fact that it's a problem means that there's something in our politics, in the decision-making over the budget, that is somehow not resulting in the outcomes you want. So then, rather than having a discussion about should we adopt a fiscal rule, which is a very narrow, it's almost like this, we've got the solution. And I think there's since Neil has provoked me by commenting on me as I'm talking, I'm going to say there's almost an opposite sin that IEJ is committing to the Treasury, which is, I'm saying, if you start in the Treasury and you say, we need a fiscal rule to solve this problem, it's like, okay, are you sure we're talking about the same problem, and why are you jumping to that solution in particular? IEJ seems to be saying, let's be against the fiscal rule and mobilize as many arguments as we can about why a fiscal rule is wrong. Understandably, maybe that's the role of IEJ. I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, but I'm saying it as a kind of intellectual exercise. That's how it comes across a little bit to me. So a different problem, if we ask a different question, not starting with the solution, but starting with the question, what are the political conditions, or what are the political, what is the political basis of fiscal sustainability? And the parts of the paper, the IEJ paper, that deal with this question are the strongest, in my view. With the political economy of the debt question and other elements. And even in the presentation, it actually put it more strongly. There was a line in your conclusions in the text. In fact, it was more strongly that it can't be a substitute for political consensus, right? And to me, that is the essential issue here. It's not about, so that's the essential issue here. So if we pose the question not as should we adopt a fiscal rule, but is the fiscal governance in South Africa, is there some problem in our fiscal governance that we can fix that will ensure fiscal sustainability? Because in the first part, I've said fiscal sustainability is that's the problem we're trying to solve. And then we're talking about governance. And then I would like to, on that, then rules, numerical targets become one policy instrument in the broader issue of governance, right? And there are other issues that are actually much more important. And I want to just point to two kind of papers, I suppose, that I think are important in this area. And the first is the contribution of Blanchard to the European Union debate about fiscal rules in the post-COVID period. And the second is also about European fiscal governance. So I've got 2.1 and 2.2. So Blanchard, basically his intervention was that the problem of fiscal sustainability is a complex problem, as I suppose I've been trying to argue as well. And therefore, the solution cannot be a simple rule. It's more complicated than that. It's always going to be. And so instead of talking about rules, we should be talking about fiscal standards. That's the phrase he used in his intervention in the European debate. And these for him are qualitative prescriptions about kind of what type of fiscal position do we want to see, or to direction that can only be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. They're qualitative. I'm not sure if I said quantitative before, but I meant qualitative, not quantitative rules, but a qualitative standard that you attempt to achieve. And part of there's two kind of sub arguments he makes. The first is that we should move away from quantitative prescriptions. Oh, sorry. The two arguments he then makes in support of that is that then, because this is a qualitative question, first of all, you need independent institutions to adjudicate in Europe as to whether a particular country is meeting the particular standard. So he says, start with fiscal standards, then you've got a reform to fiscal institutions that might support this standards approach. But the second thing is to move away from what he calls the pure public finance view of debt sustainability. And unquestionably, Treasury has not moved away from the pure public finance. They are in a crude, pure public finance view of fiscal sustainability. And many of the arguments that IEJ is making is also kind of picking at that. Correctly so, because they're vulnerable on that, because it is more complex. So secondly, and so before I move away from this point, the map that Liso showed of fiscal rules globally is very telling, because and this is the point I want to make about the IMF and the criticism of the IMF. In my view, the IMF is not a fair and objective authority on these issues, because the board of the IMF is dominated by Europe. The managing director of the IMF is appointed by Europe. And as we know from more than 350 years of history, Europe has a penchant for exporting its institutions, to put it politely. So Europe has, of course, totally ignored everything that Blanchard said and has reverted to this crude public finance view itself, which rests on a crude numerical targets. And there's no discussion about Blanchard's proposal. It was rejected. So Europe is solving its own problems with this fiscal rule architecture, mechanical public finance fiscal rule architecture. It has failed them in the past. They're doubling down and proceeding on that road. Nobody else in the world really is, except a few like the progressive government in Brazil that wants to entrench credibility with the markets, you know, and maybe us. Nobody in America would ever talk about a fiscal rule. So the IMF is kind of congenitally bound to advance and has consistently, in my experience over 25 years, argued for a debt ceiling come hell or high water. And I think it's something that should be rejected, actually. The second, so I'm still on this issue of what is the political basis for fiscal sustainability. And I'm saying if we had a debate about fiscal standards rather than numerical targets, and we had a political debate about what do we define as fiscal sustainability and what do we want to see for us, that's a much easier debate to build a consensus around than should the debt target be 70% or 60%. That one nobody's ever going to agree on. Nobody is ever going to agree on that stuff, right? And as soon as you say it should be 60%, you're going to generate a huge argument and massive fiscal contraction, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that's what the IMF's suggesting, and wrongly in my view. Okay, the second set of issues around then how do we build a political consensus around fiscal sustainability is to do with fiscal governance, the studies literature on fiscal governance in Europe. And there are two types of fiscal system. There are centralized systems where there's centralized authority over the budget, and there are fragmented systems in which budget authority is highly fragmented. Brazil, by the way, happens to be the latter. And that's why it's responsible for a whole lot of problems in Brazil, which I won't go into now. But the example that I think Liso, I can't remember, was pointing to about subnational government is part of that fragmentation, but it's much broader than that. Or you have a centralized system, and fortunately, in my view, for us, we have one of the most centralized fiscal systems in the world. And I say that's fortunately because for me, that is a fundamental condition for effective redistribution, is that centralization. And so the point about European fiscal governments is that there are two models that can achieve fiscal sustainability in a centralized fiscal system. The first is what is called delegation, where essentially you say, finance minister, we give you responsibility for fiscal sustainability. We delegate the authority to you, much in the same way that monetary policy authority is delegated to the Reserve Bank or the central bank. There's a delegate, and so Britain typically functions like that. And obviously we typically function like that. So we're both highly centralized and we have a delegated fiscal policy decision-making system. The other way of doing it, you would call a contract approach. And as it happens in Europe, this second approach is judged to be more effective in conditions of coalition government, because the delegation only really works if within government there's basic ideological agreement on what is the objective of fiscal policy. In the sense, I mean, to make a parallel with or analogy with monetary policy, you agree on the mandate, and then the Reserve Bank executes the policy or whatever, the target, or sets the target and operates, or whatever the case is. So in situations where you've got a kind of dominant party, a single party dominating government, that delegation can work very effectively because that dominant party also has to agree about those fiscal objectives. But if you have a coalition government, a better approach is to try and have a more consensual, negotiated approach to fiscal policy. And so in conclusion, I would say that the fundamental problem we have in South Africa today, and the reason why we're having this debate about fiscal rules, is the model of delegation has reached its limits. Treasury knows that whatever power it has in its hands, it's not able to give effect to the objective of fiscal sustainability. And as a result, budgets are becoming increasingly less credible as projections of the future. And therefore, my answer to that question is that we need to move fiscal policy into we need to have some social compact type discussion on fiscal policy that can agree on a contract between the various, because this is about balancing different interests, including the interest of people who depend on government spending. Somebody has to look after their interests, and IEJ is part of that, and that is good. But this is something that has to be kind of, people have to meet each other halfway on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting, around political economy issues, the changing nature of South Africa's kind of political makeup, and what has worked in the past might not work now. But I'll hand over to Krige to give his inputs before we open up the discussion.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I've had two things in mind for the few minutes allocated to me. The first was to give a sort of a summary of a working paper I prepared with Estiaan College for UNU Wider in 2023. Paper is available on the UNU Wider website. And then I wanted to say a bit more about the idea of fiscal standards. So I now face the very typical problem of the last speaker. I had read the IEJ discussion paper, so I was aware of the many similarities between our assessments of fiscal rules, and I thought it's still worthwhile to emphasize some of those again. but then maybe add the theme of fiscal standards. But now Michael has stolen my thunder on that as well. I'll take that as a case of great minds think alike. But let's see if I can perhaps flesh out some of his arguments a little more. So I think something that we should perhaps keep in mind is that there are different ways of thinking about the functions of fiscal rules. So our topic today is very much about binding fiscal rules. So that implies one particular perspective of fiscal rules as constraints on fiscal policymakers. So that's pretty much the view of those who feel that discretionary policymaking tends to fail in the fiscal field. And there is, of course, a lot of evidence that discretionary policymaking can often lead to sustained budget deficits, public debt accumulation, and destabilizing or pro-cyclical policies as well. This constraints type view is also associated with those who feel that government should be small and that they have a tendency to outgrow the utility, public choice economists and others. But there's also a different view which sees fiscal rules as enabling devices. So that's a core theme in modern macroeconomics. The idea there is that fiscal policies work best when they affect the expectations of private sector agents in ways that strengthen their effects. And in order to do that, fiscal policy should be credible. And to get that done, it's important to have solid commitments to certain policy stances. Fiscal rules are then seen as ways to do those commitments and also signal that you are committed to certain policies. The enabling view, I think, can also be associated with those who feel that there's a case for yardsticks that strengthen democratic accountability. That is also a possible role that fiscal rules may play by giving clear standards of what governments are trying to achieve. Again, as I say, our theme today is perhaps the constraints view, but I would like to shift the focus towards the enablers view as well. And I think that will also tie in with some of the ideas that Michael had about consensus around certain fiscal policy principles. But let me first of all look at what we know at this stage about numerical rules as effective constraints. As I said before, I think what I have to say here is very similar to what Liso and Zimbale had to say, so I will try to be as quick as possible. I think it's very clear, and become very clear during the past 2 or so decades, that numerical rules cannot prevent huge accumulations of public debt during crises. It was, of course, a particularly turbulent time, and one could argue that these were abnormal times as well, but the fact remains that the rules could not prevent many countries from accumulating large stocks of public debt. So that much is clear. The point that Zimbale and Liso made about the breaching of rules is also very relevant. They've showed you similar numbers as well, showing just how common breaches of rules are. But that's not the whole story. There's also a lot of evidence, even by those who acknowledge the regularity or commonality of breaches, that those countries that do adopt fiscal rules very often do have smaller budget deficits and slower levels of public debt accumulation after the adoption of those rules or after the strengthening of existing rules. Those who take this view would also argue that the main role of policy rules would not be to prevent public debt accumulation during crises, but to enable policymakers to handle those crises better by empowering policymakers to create fiscal buffers during more normal times. So on the basis of this, it's not that easy to completely dismiss the claim that fiscal policy rules are to some degree effective, but again, there are some complications to that conclusion. One is the continuing debate about what really determines the outcomes of fiscal policy rules. If we see improvements in fiscal policy outcomes after the adoption of rules, are those truly the effect of the rules themselves, or perhaps of strengthening commitments to fiscal prudence within the government itself, or even within broader societies? And such commitments could be the basis for adopting the rules and for improving the fiscal outcomes. In a sense, in an econometric sense, it could become a sort of an omitted factor. And then a point that Liso and Zimbale also made very clearly is just how complicated rules-based fiscal policy making tends to be in practice. So they have referred to all of these things. The many cases in which attempts to remain compliant with rules may force or at least incentivize governments to undertake economically and socially harmful steps. Pro-cyclical fiscal tightening to remain compliant with rules is a very clear and well-known example. Also indiscriminate cuts to public spending. There are also clear political risks to attempts to comply with binding rules. I think we had a very interesting example of this in November last year, when the German traffic light coalition unraveled largely as a result of a lack of consensus about the constitutional debt brake. It's ironic that that fiscal rule had for a long time been seen as an example of an excellent fiscal rule, created in 2009. It was often touted as something to be emulated by other countries as well, but these political implications tell a very different story. And then we've heard a lot also about the incentives that numerical rules tend to create for accounting and other tricks to feign compliance. Much has been said about the scope for preventing these sorts of problems through good design of fiscal rules. And yes, to some degree, it is possible to prevent some of the most obvious problems, but it's seldom possible to do that in a completely costless manner. A paper by De Bruin and Joan in 2019 was, in this sense, very interesting to me. They argued that a good fiscal rule should have three properties. It should be simple, both to the policymakers themselves and also to the public and to financial market participants. A rule should be flexible to prevent the sort of harmful economic responses in order to remain compliant. And it should also be enforceable. In some way, there should be accountability for compliance with the rule. But the important point of that paper was that in reality, only two of those properties can be achieved at the same time. So trade-offs, difficulties are inevitable. At some point, these are likely to arise. One very clear example would be that a normal budget balance rule, like the 3% rule of the European Union, is very simple, but of course also inflexible. And attempts to make rules such as that one more flexible would, for example, entail the use of cyclically adjusted budget balances as opposed to normal ones. And immediately a considerable degree of complexity is introduced in the rule, which makes it a lot harder to assess compliance. All sorts of controversies arise around the calculations and so on. So those are the sort of trade-offs that inevitably arise, and design can, at this stage at least, not overcome all of those. I think Michael has alluded to this as well. There is a real risk that countries may end up chopping and changing rules almost indefinitely in an attempt, a futile attempt in the end, to design a perfect rule of some nature. And my sense is that this is pretty much what has been happening in the EU. The rules have been suspended at least twice this century, most recently from 2020 to 23. And last year in April, a new set of rules was announced. They partly attempt to compensate for some of the weaknesses of earlier rules, but immediately there's been commentators arguing that these rules will introduce new problems and that we may well see similar sorts of economic and political problems arising in the future. So in the case of South Africa, the argument that Professor Collins and I made in our paper was that we should be very realistic about what numerical rules can achieve in South Africa, also with regards to future debt sustainability. We should certainly not expect too much given the international evidence, and we and the policymakers should be well aware of all the difficulties that would be introduced by rules-based fiscal policymaking. Other speakers have also referred to some of the conditions for success. They are indeed demanding. Apart from good design, strong political buy-in is essential for rules to work, and economic stability, economic growth are also key factors as well. So on the basis of that, we argued that South Africa's current regime, which we have elsewhere classified as one of transparency-based discretion, remains a viable alternative to numerical rules, and one that may well be equally relevant, equally viable for dealing with our current fiscal problems. So we, of course, have the expenditure ceiling, but from a purely technical perspective, that is not a strong rule, not based in legislation. There are no strong enforcement mechanisms involved as well. And for that reason, the basic elements of our regime, in our view, remain the MTF and the PFMA, which are very much transparency-based instruments. We would argue that this sort of regime is very well suited to anchoring the expectations of the private sector and gaining the macroeconomic benefits that may follow from that. And it is also potentially very useful for enhancing democratic accountability by making fiscal policy making quite transparent. Given that fiscal rules often are breached and that they introduce all these difficulties, we are also not convinced that there is much of a loss of commitment in remaining with the current regime as opposed to shifting to one of numerical fiscal rules. There is one footnote then that we added, and I would like to expand then a little bit on the idea of fiscal standards that Michael has raised as well. I here refer also to the same paper by Blanchard et al. As Michael rightly pointed out, the basis of that paper is the argument that fiscal sustainability assessment is in practice such a fuzzy process that in the end attaching a number to that and arguing that that should be at least a long-term, perhaps even a permanent target for fiscal policy makes very little sense. So the notion of a fiscal standards as an alternative to that would then entail making very general statements of the objectives of fiscal policy. For example, whereas a pure rule would state that public debt should not exceed 60% of GDP, fiscal standards in its pure form would say that the excessive public debt burden should be avoided. Now, it's very clear that that is a very vague yardstick, and obviously for policymakers themselves, but also for the public and for financial markets, there is very little content in such a standard by itself. So that the real teeth of fiscal standards would then be the addition of processes to assess whether actual policies meet these standards. One country that has for quite a long period of time, more than 30 years now, followed an approach that has largely been based on fiscal standards has been New Zealand. New Zealand in 1989 adopted the first act that enshrined some of these principles, but the 1994 Fiscal Responsibility Act specified 5 principles or fiscal standards that have been enforced ever since. There are 3 examples of those. The first one has to do with public debt sustainability. The second one, strongly reminiscent of the golden rule of fiscal policy, avoiding borrowing for financing current expenditure. And the third then, a standard specifically related to the intergenerational dimension of fiscal policy. These principles are accompanied by very detailed reporting requirements. So each government of the day is legally obliged to publish, to disclose its interpretation of those standards within the current economic and social environment, and also to report in a very detailed form about the degree to which there is consistency between its policies and those basic principles or standards. As listed there, the standards largely have had to do with macroeconomic considerations of fiscal policy, but there has been a widening over time. So there is now also a standard that focuses on the composition of the budget, both on the expenditure and the revenue side. So the principles can be expanded beyond narrow considerations of public debt sustainability. Would this approach be helpful to South Africa? We are well aware of the risks of importing any particular institutional framework from elsewhere. So a lot of research and debate would have to go into any attempt to realize a standards-based framework in the South African case. We do believe, though, that it is worth considering. It seems to be an almost natural extension of our transparency-based discretion regime to introduce such standards. And it would, to some degree, also deal partly, at least, with the criticism that this type of regime is inferior to a rules-based one in terms of the strength of the commitment that it implies, and also the scope that it offers for constraining government policies. Such a regime, on the other hand, is of course more flexible than rules, and in that case, in that sense, also can overcome that particular weakness. The proof of the pudding will obviously be in the eating, but also in the planning of a regime of this nature. I think we would have to think hard about a number of critical questions. Those are 3 that I can certainly think about. Who should determine fiscal standards? To what degree should this be a technocratic exercise, or can it be a broader democratic one? I think this is where Michael's point of building more consensus about basic fiscal principles become very relevant. Second point that I've alluded to already with the New Zealand example would relate to the scope of fiscal standards. Should there only be macroeconomic? Is there perhaps even scope for introducing something like the realization of socioeconomic rights as part of the set of standards that should guide fiscal policymaking, and also oblige the government of the day then to disclose its own view on these matters and how they realize those rights under current economic circumstances? And then the question would also arise how the consistency between standards and policies should be assessed in an unbiased manner. My understanding of the New Zealand case is that this is very much a political matter where normal political debate basically constitutes the assessment. Because each government adds its own interpretation and often adds concrete targets to the standards, there is a definite political cost in terms of not reaching those standards. And so that cost may be seen as part of the enforcement capacity of such a system. But one may want to think about other mechanisms as well to get a more unbiased assessment into that broader system. So I would very much like to leave it at that. And thank you. And I look forward to further discussion of these matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krige. That concludes our formal presentations as per the program. But given that there was discussion about kind of institutions and the role they play, I'd like to invite Siraj Mohammed to, just make some comments. Siraj is from the Parliamentary Budget Office.
Hi, can you hear me? Good, thanks. I do work in the Parliamentary Budget Office, but when I speak in these kind of public forums, I do not represent Parliament or the Parliamentary Budget Office. It just needs to be clear. So I'm going to be speaking as a heterodox economist who is listening to people talk about these issues very much from within the rules and presumptions and assumptions of a neoclassical macroeconomic framework. And when neoclassical macroeconomists start talking about reality, when reality starts seep into the minds of neoclassical macroeconomists, and makes for interesting paradoxes, contradictions, and discussion. And clearly, since the global financial crisis, COVID, when monetary policy was shown to be ineffective because interest rates were so low, it actually created a place where we can have a discussion. And I think we're having an interesting discussion today, and I want to congratulate the IEJ for this forum, but also Zimbale and Liso and others for this very interesting paper. I mean, I think I agree with Michael. The really interesting part of this paper was looking at the politics and how fiscal policies, fiscal rules, when countries attempt to try them, do work. And notwithstanding Krige's point that, well, countries that that have these end up having lower debt levels and sort of whatever happens in those countries, I think, it's interesting that most neoclassical economists will ignore, for instance, people say, well, countries that have capital controls and exchange controls have less, problems with financial crises. But yeah, those are the kind of things that your religion brings you to. And we speak from very different religions, and mine is, so I do want to make a call for a reality-based view of macroeconomics, where to start off with, we don't actually, and this discussion for me reflected it a lot, particularly from Michael and Krige, is the way in which neoclassical macroeconomics has sort of straitjacketed us, this ontological cage that people are stuck into, and then try and impose that on a broader discussion, and on a discussion of saying, well, this is realistic and this is not. This is what your creditors think, and this is therefore what you have to do. But the basis of the neoclassical macroeconomics is that in the long term you still have the classical dichotomy, the separation of what happens in real markets and financial markets. And so, in this kind of saying, well, maybe in the short term the dichotomy doesn't hold, but in the long term it does. It doesn't address other tensions across the macro-micro divide that cannot readily be incorporated into the framework of microeconomics because they're systemic in character And these include things like the distribution of income, monopolies, a concentration of economies, the role of trade unions and other institutions in the macroeconomic functioning of countries, and also, not least, technological change. So in calling for a reality-based discussion of this, I actually don't think we can ever, whatever rules, whatever you want to impose through your fiscal governance framework or whatever you want to call it, you're always going to have an unsustainable fiscal situation in South Africa as long as you have structural unemployment, poverty, and inequality. As long as people are shit poor, are struggling, and children are dying because the government wants to impose austerity. It doesn't matter whether the fiscal rules, we actually have to understand that reality. We are a hugely concentrated economy, and also in that, we have to understand the behavior of the financial markets, our integration into global financial systems and the global economy, and what this means in terms of what the large corporations have been doing, the 100 biggest on the JSE or others who you want to look at, in terms of how they've chosen to allocate capital and how that allocation of capital has led to deindustrialization, not creating jobs, creating more, unsustainability within the economy, and then government basically not looking at all those real issues because they also stuck in this neoclassical macroeconomics cage. They then start looking for solutions that are just around budgets, basically believing that monetary policy has to be independent and that fiscal policy can't be. And just to go back again to neoclassical macroeconomics, I mean, the shift from monetarism to rational expectation theory and real business cycle theory, you need to have a shift from in how you think about expectations. You need to have a model of the economy where the agents in the model have the same model of view of the economy, and you apply all the crazy assumptions that come with neoclassical theory. And then you have this view of the state, a reduced view of basically a state that can't do anything, a state that's just another agent in the economy that basically has its own self-interest. And so when we talk about things like fiscal rules, when we talk about austerity, when we talk about macroeconomic theory, we actually aren't talking about the craziness in the thinking, underlying the thinking that shapes this idea that you have an independent central bank, or you need fiscal rules, or you need government not to be populist and constrained. I really think, that heterodox economists should be allowed much more space to come up with realistic based alternatives. I think a lot of this discussion is shaped too much and seen too much as the domain of people who are sort of the grown-ups in the room, the modern macroeconomics who understand, how things work. And so, yeah, I'm going to stop there before I get into being rude and use words like shit. So I'm going to say, yeah, that's my contribution. It's a call for a realist-based macroeconomics underlying the way we think, and understanding that the reasons why we're not going to be fiscally sustainable is because we actually have structural problems and we're not dealing with them in a sustainable way. Sorry, just one more thing to say. I mean, it's interesting that people brought up Blanchard so much, but there's a really interesting paper by Stiglitz, Osher, and Rubin, 2021, sort of looking at the impact of the pandemic and calling for semi-autonomous fiscal discretion. So those are three authors where I agree with Stiglitz more than the others, but they still work within quite a neoclassical framework. But they basically recognize and they bring in uncertainty and not knowing what the future will hold. Also calling for more reality and basically saying that instead of trying to have top-down rules, whether they're formal or not, that you put in place automatic stabilizers that support the poor, that move the economy to full employment and do other things. And in South Africa, that could go over a really long period of time. We could start putting in place those kind of policies. And then when we have crises like the pandemic, we also have discretion to spend more. And it's a stimulus-based view of the world, not an anal cut expenditure type view of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suraj. Yeah, so lots of food for thought from our commentator, our presenters. And I would invite participants to put their questions in the chat so that our panelists can answer, but maybe just to get the discussion started, I think that, you know, everyone kind of touched on it, but this idea that the National Treasury is kind of tied to a primary surplus as a measure of fiscal sustainability, when actually we find ourselves in a country that has huge developmental needs, huge socioeconomic challenges, and, you know, that the primary surplus is an imposed idea that really is just a measure of austerity rather than sustainability. And Michael and Neil have jumped forward, so I'll go to Michael first and then to the comments.
No, I was just going to say, in fact, this was one of the main arguments that Blanchard puts forward, is that the primary surplus that ensures fiscal sustainability may not be politically sustainable in Europe. And this is one of the main reasons why he suggests this shifts to standards. And I think, I mean, I just want to also thank Krige. I hope he's going to write a paper about these standards because for me, this is exactly the kind of discussion we should have. Okay, debt sustainability, in my view, is a issue, but a rising floor of social and economic rights is also an issue. And let's not, let's have a discussion about that, and maybe we can find each other. I don't know on those types of issues.
Thank you, Michael. And then Neil has just kind of spoken to the distinction drawn between standards and targets, and whether they're imposed in ways that are inappropriate and can be damaging. Okay, that's not really, it's just a comment. So, question from the floor. And Michael, you're probably best placed to answer this because you spoke most about the European Union, but Krige, I'd also invite you to come in, given your talk around targets and standards, that there is a lot of reference to these EU-based standards and fiscals, again, via this imposition onto the rest of the world. And how then do the African Union and SADC countries move to kind of something that's more orientated towards their needs and goals? Krige?
I would certainly argue that a set of fiscal standards would have to be very country specific, and that, I mean, that's the point that I try to make as well, that we cannot wholesale import anything from New Zealand or from any other place. But the only reason I think why all of us have referred to these countries is that, I mean, the specific argument was made in the EU context by Blanchard and his co-authors, and we have that example of New Zealand. Others that have gone some way along this route has been Australia and to some degree the UK. I think the UK has largely moved away from the standards idea. So that's purely the examples that we have at the moment. But I fully agree that we cannot borrow any set of standards from an advanced country also.
Thank you. Michael, on the AU SADC orientated standards?
So I was going to say, I mean, of course, Europe has a particular problem in that they have a single currency, and so a single central bank and a single monetary policy, but fiscal policy is sovereign, and that's a contradiction. And so that's so those conditions wouldn't apply in Africa. And more generally, I mean,
we're having the debate now about debt in Africa, in particular in relation to the G20, but I would be worried about, I wouldn't look at that level just because I think South Africa's fiscal dynamics are so different from the fiscal dynamics of other countries in debt distress. And so I would be cautious about trying to get one framework that applies to us all. Europe is forced to have one framework that applies to them all because of the monetary issue. I will leave the other questions from Neil to others.
Liso and Zimbale, do you have anything to add on the AU and SADC orientated standards?
I don't. I haven't read much on that, so I'll leave it to the colleagues on the panel.
Okay.
I know Siraj has also written comments on that to SADC as well, so I'd be interested to hear what he says. I think, yeah, I'm very pleased with the discussion. I just wanted to emphasize that in reference to the earlier point by Michael, we do think that there is a problem around fiscal sustainability, but we think that, and we acknowledge the high interest payments that we pay, and I think that our proposal moves us towards a more direct alternatives of tackling the cost of borrowing, right? Because we think that, like all others have acknowledged, imposing a fiscal rule won't effectively address the cost of borrowing, but it also comes on top of the structural issues that we still facing, which we also need to address. And this is beyond just the critiques that we see in international literature on fiscal rules. We think that there's a more direct way to address the cost of borrowing. But I think the point you raised around like fiscal, how do we build a fiscal consensus and the systems around them, whether it's a delegated system or it's a social contract type, I think our context in South Africa still calls for the latter. We know that the hold the National Treasury has on fiscal policy making, and I think would be very dangerous for us to continue on the path that we've taken. And we need to, in thinking about fiscal standards and other alternatives, consider the context in which the policy framework and the policy space is still largely closed, and what does that mean for the alternatives we're thinking about?
Thanks, Zimbale. So Zimbale opened the door to you, Siraj, to speak about some of the work that you've done. Would you be able to come in and comment?
Yeah, I actually didn't want to talk too much about this because my view is that the fiscal standards should be within a system where you actually have fiscal dominance, not monetary dominance, which is what the current system is and what mainstream economists want. And then it's about making sure that government has a developmental program and a development path that supports social security and welfare, and at the same time includes that in the program to reindustrialize and rebuild the economy and create jobs and those kind of things. And so for me, those are the standards that we should be pursuing, and that we should have the discretion to do that. And the argument is, and I mean, I looked at the PP's document. I mean, a lot of it, or they do mention problems with aggregate demand. I mean, I think once you start changing your approach to thinking about the South African economy and the problems that they have, you start thinking about a different approach to what's going to make debt and deficit sustainable. And also, I mean, I'm sounding very kind of unorthodox or maybe even worse. But you know, the whole notion of debt to GDP, the fact that we give GDP this elevated space within all our discussions, and we judge things by GDP rather than, you know, some other index like the Human Development Index or some other thing, you know, is a huge problem, especially in South Africa, especially when we're facing a crisis, where we need to build resilience, where, you know, our survival in the next, I don't know how many years, is going to rely on a different way of thinking about what sustainability is. And so sort of still giving GDP and then putting everything as a ratio to GDP for me is a problem as well. So yeah, I mean, so my whole sense of standards and my response to some of what was coming out of SADC or AU around how they approach fiscal rules and standards was to say, you know, let's start opening up this debate to more pluralism and a different view, and let's not get caught up in an unrealistic model that then we try and say, well, but we have to bring in some reality to it. Thanks. Sorry, I don't know if that was a useful answer.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so as on this thing of just to agree with what Suraj said about this measure of GDP being constantly used as a standard. I mean, that is why we are in some of these situations around climate disasters, huge amounts of carbon emissions, is this drive to continually push GDP and grow and stimulate the economy and development that way. But just to, you know, go back to the issues around institutions, and this should link to what Neil was asking about the accountability of an institution like National Treasury, is, you know, it also comes back to whether you believe institutions are what lead to economic growth. So you have your kind of legislative institutions, and then you have your de facto institutions, which is what is the power that pushes institutional development. And certainly over the last 15 to 20 years, both with the international economic crises and our own economic trajectory through state capture and now coalition government, we cannot be operating in the system believing that the treasury that existed in 1994 is the same treasury that exists now, because all these institutions have been constantly evolving given the outside forces penetrating onto the system. So I would invite presenters and panelists to give their comments around accountability and institutions. And then also from the floor, we just had some comments around, you know, reliance on aid for certain programs. South Africa's good standing in terms of not having a large portion of foreign-based debt. Okay. Well, I mean, maybe I could invite the panelists to make some closing remarks, as we seem to have addressed the questions that have arisen. And I'll start with Go backwards, Siraj, if you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, no, I'd prefer not to start. I sort of came into this late because I expected to be in a meeting all day today. So I think it's better for me to listen to other people and maybe have a short comment at the end. But yeah, thanks. Sorry.
All right. Krige? You're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. I don't have much to add, but I think it's been a very useful discussion, and I would like to commend the IEJ for initiating it. Some of these themes that we've touched upon now, the issue of a political consensus around fiscal policy, how to, in a certain sense, democratize at least the determination of broad fiscal goals and objectives are really important, and things should be pursued further. They may take a certain form in South Africa, but these are international problems as well. From everything I've read, it is particularly hard to transfer or to change fiscal policy making from a technocratic exercise to something more consultative or democratic. We should certainly not stop trying. We should have this discussion much more. But this is a problem that we share with many other countries.
Thank you. Michael?
You know, there was a formulation in Liso's slide, I think one of Liso's slides, about fiscal policy or fiscal sustainability. And I think Neil also alluded to this in one of his comments. The kind of economic growth determines fiscal sustainability rather than the other way around. And I agree with that entirely. But see, if you're going to say that, then it's almost as if you're saying fiscal policy, that the line of causation does not go from fiscal policy to growth and development. The line of causation comes from other places. The line of causation comes from global developments in particular. That and as I said, the fact that we've got a third tier currency in a global currency hierarchy means that we're particularly vulnerable to global developments, and it comes from I think the challenge to fiscal sustainability in South Africa right now structurally is coming from the fact that this model of delegation to national treasury, which others have also been alluding to in different language, using different words, I don't know, but it has almost reached its limits because Treasury's control over fiscal policy is not able to, it is not able to change the direction of policy. So, for example, there's a human resources for health policy, which everybody agrees about, even the Treasury. But the budget is moving in exactly the opposite direction as far as employment in that public health system. So these contradictions are becoming more difficult to manage, and this model of delegation has reached its limits. And that's why Treasury is putting the issue of fiscal rules on the table. And my response to them, I would just say, I'm not saying it should be your response, but my response is, let's have a conversation about fiscal institutions and the political basis of fiscal policy rather than narrowly on fiscal rules.
Thank you. Liso?
Thank you, Joan. I think my concluding point will just be on something Krige touched on, which is the chopping and changing of the rules. I think part of the reason why we are even having a conversation about binding fiscal anchors is because I don't think, I think National Treasury's assessment of the failure of the previous, or rather the current fiscal anchor in place, which is the expenditure ceiling, is quite weak. I don't think they've correctly assessed it. Part of their reasoning is that the expenditure ceiling failed because it is not binding, which I don't think is true. We saw, for example, in its first more or less 6 years, it functioned quite well by their own account. It functioned quite well to control spending. Of course, we know that kind of coincided with the period of the start of fiscal consolidation. There's something to be said about that too. But yeah, I think they are making a big jump from, okay, the expenditure ceiling has lost its credibility in the previous years, to say one way to restore its credibility or the credibility of fiscal policy is to then have this binding fiscal rule. So I think, yeah, from Treasury's part, it would be interesting to see what their output is, the paper they have said they will publish, and how they assess the success and failures of the expenditure ceiling. Thank you.
Thanks, Liso. Zimbale?
Thank you, Jones. I think mine would be just to thank the panelists for their time, and everyone who set aside their time to attend today, and to say we'll be taking the discussions we had into account as we deliberate further on this topic. We invited National Treasury to also participate, but they couldn't as they're under embargo. So we're trying to set up a bilateral engagement with them, and hopefully we can use that as a stepping stone to open up the space and, yeah, discuss this topic further. Thank you.
Thanks, Zimbale. Yes, so thank you very much to our panelists and to our participants for engaging in what I felt was a very robust discussion. Obviously, a lot to still talk through, debate, maybe write on. And, you know, just to let everybody know that this is one of the first fiscal webinars that the IEJ will be holding in a series going over, you know, we'll be talking about some of the other outputs from the organization, and so watch the space for further invites to webinars. Okay, thank you. Have a good day.